ABC Friday.
It just takes one great idea to change your life.
Shark Tank returns for its 15th season.
I didn't know I was going to cry right now.
With new guest sharks, Jason Blum of Blumhouse, Michael Rubin of Fanatics, and Candace Nelson of Sprinkles Cupcakes.
I'm going to make you an offer.
On a scale of 1 to 10.
I've never seen anything like this on Shark Tank.
This season is a 15.
I totally believe in you.
Shark Tank premieres Friday on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Scores from the standardized tests Oregon students take each year are out, and the 2023 results are dispiriting, to say the least. I'm Elliot Noose, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. I'm joined today by education reporter Julia Silverman, who's analyzed these results for the Oregonian and OregonLive. Julia, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Elliot. I wish I could say that I was here to talk about something more cheerful.
Well, give us the top line.
Sadly, no.
Give us the top line results, please. How are students performing academically, at least as far as these tests can tell us?
Sigh. Things are not terrific. And the words that I used while writing this story were words like stagnate and mired and stuck. And that's because everybody knows that after the pandemic, as we would expect, after such disruption to kids' academic environment, there was a lot of academic recovery that needed to be done, or learning loss, as it's popularly termed. So it wasn't a huge surprise when scores from spring of 2022 were pretty bleak and dismal. But last year, the 2022-2023 school year, I think a lot of parents would tell you was a year that felt much closer to back to normal, right? The masks were gone. There wasn't this sort of creeping fear that your school was going to suddenly close because of a COVID outbreak. Extracurriculars returned, and it felt to many people like things were somewhat back on some kind of a recognizable track. I don't want to say normal because, we live in a new post-pandemic normal now. So I think there was some hope that by the time the Oregon assessment tests rolled around in spring of 2023, that we would see a reflection of that things would be a little better. And in fact, that is what we've seen in some other states, right? Not necessarily a return to pre-pandemic achievement levels, but a steady pattern of growth in Washington, in Massachusetts, in Tennessee, in North Carolina. So it's certainly possible. We do not see that in Oregon. The scores are essentially exactly where they were in 2022. There's not been a great deal of movement or momentum. And that's, as you said at the top, dispiriting to say the least. Not the story I wanted to write this week.
So what does that tell us about how students are recovering or failing to recover from the pandemic and their time away from in-person instruction?
Right. Talking to state education officials about this week, they've been really quick to emphasize that this test is a snapshot. It's a point in time, and it certainly is not going to tell you everything that you need to know about how students are recovering. And listen, I think that that's a really valid point. No single test can be looked at as the definitive be-all and end-all. However, this is not the only data point that has pointed us to a lack of recovery among Oregon students, right? I'll do another story like this in a couple weeks when the results from the nation's report card come out, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I think that's what the A stands for there. And I sure hope they're better than last year, but Oregon kids have really consistently shown that they are not making the kinds of gains that they would need to get back to pre-pandemic levels, which, by the way, aren't what we wanted them to be even before schools closed in this state for 18 months, right? Nobody is going to be like, hooray, 51% of the kids can read at grade level. We're all done here. It's not the way it works. And that was pre-pandemic. Now we're at about 40% of kids, give or take, testing, achieving proficiency. You should stop me here and say, Julia, what does proficiency mean? And I'll tell you that it means that a kid is on track to be ready for college or the workforce when they graduate. So that might sound a little crazy for a third grader, but school is building blocks, right? Each year you're building the strategies and the knowledge that you're going to need to succeed in the next year.
And that points to the big picture here, which is, there is a sort of generational effect, right? Where the students who are behind today in third grade will, they are 9 years away from graduating. And that is essentially the time that we have to catch up.
Exactly. Or please think about the kids who are in 7th and 8th grade last year who have 4 years to catch up because the middle school results were really some of the most, flashing red light alarm, all hands on deck here, at least for me. Let's see, I told you 40% in English language arts. It's only 30% of students statewide, give or take, across the board for math. So, and that was at around 40% before the pandemic. So, if we weren't great pre-pandemic, we're not great now, and we're not seeing, the most important thing is that we aren't seeing the kind of growth that I think everybody, me included, educators, the governor, everybody wanted to see, at least this year, some indication of growth. And it's just not there. So, what we heard a lot of from the state this week was, well, we're stabilizing. Okay. I mean, I guess that's good. We didn't fall even further, but honestly, we didn't have that much further to fall. Right.
So you mentioned that state officials, talk about this as a snapshot. There are certainly some misgivings about standardized testing as a metric overall. Tell me about how state officials, how they use this result and in sort of making sure that the state's educational programming is what kids need.
Right. So, I mean, the great thing about these tests, and the good news is that it gives us a lot of really great data that every district in the state gets to unpack now. And they can see, okay, how did kids who don't speak English as their first language in third grade do in math? Okay, their gains are below their white peers or their black peers or whatever. Well, then that is the population of students, and they have this on the school level, right? So they can say, all right, this elementary school in our district is a school that really needs help with third grade kids who don't speak English as a first language learning math. So it does certainly inform the decisions that school districts can make around where they can dispatch instructional specialists, educational aides who can help in classrooms, where they can consider paying for tutors or expanding after school programs. It helps school districts be able to make those kinds of decisions. Now, you asked about state officials. What's interesting about Oregon and what comes into every story like this that I or any other education reporter around the state is ever going to write is that we are very much a local control state. So, school districts get the bulk of their budget from state funding, but the state does not tell them how to spend that money. So on some level, the state's hands are not tied. That's not fair. That's letting them off the hook a little bit too much. But they have somewhat limited control over what districts can do to address these issues because they don't get to say how Portland or Beaverton or Coos Bay or Klamath Falls or any other district spends their money.
So because of that local control, there are some schools that are trying some new things to make up for learning loss. Are any of those showing promise?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because I've been in such a bad mood all week about this. um, our mutual colleague said to me at one point, "You're Yosemite Sam," with sparks coming out of my head. But there are actually some districts that showed some growth and some promise, and I want to call some of them out because I'll be writing about them in the coming days. And this is the point here is that this is not impossible. It is not impossible to help kids. It is not impossible to get kids back on track. There are districts that are doing it. So kudos to Grants Pass down in Southern Oregon. And I'm talking to some folks there yesterday. They made gains across all grades in both math and English. That's fairly unusual as far as I can see from the data. Same goes, frankly, for Portland Public Schools, which is quite pleased with themselves. And has a right to be because they did show growth across all student populations. Although once you disaggregate Portland Public's data, you can see that traditionally underserved student groups, students of color, students who don't speak English as their first language, students who live under the poverty line, didn't make that same level of growth. So, and I think the district would tell you too, hey, we still have work to do. But certainly there's things to be learned from Portland. There are things to be learned from Grants Pass. North Clackamas showed some growth in math. That's a fairly large suburban district. And the Scappoose School District, also outside of Portland, made some real gains in their English language arts. So I'll be talking to all of those districts to find out a little bit more about what they've done. I was out at Sitton Elementary School today, which is a elementary school in St. John's that PPS officials are really proud of. And I had the chance to talk to the principal there. And she told me that they send their instructional coaches and reading specialists, they don't pull kids out of the classroom. They push them into the classroom. They have them sitting next to small clusters of kids that they know need help. And they're there during the classroom teacher's lesson to offer support when the kids ask for it. That's kind of an interesting model. And it's something is obviously working there. Maybe there's something that other schools within Portland or other districts can learn
So
from.
you mean instead of sort of yanking kids out of class to go, do sort of remedial work because they're behind?
Right. And nationally, research has suggested that the best possible way to catch up all these kids who lost learning after the pandemic is something called high dosage, high frequency tutoring, which is a concept that I write about every chance I get. And if you are a school district official and you're listening to this podcast and you want me to come to your district and write about your high dose tutoring program, please call me. Silverman at Oregonian.com. But that idea pulls groups of 1 to 3 kids out for one-on-one intensive, skills, at their level instruction with what they need. And if you do that, best practices are during the school day, multiple times a week. That can make a difference for kids. It is expensive. And it is complicated with scheduling, right? Because you have to make sure that those kids aren't getting pulled out at a moment when they're going to miss something crucial in their classroom, which is why the sit and push in model really caught my attention this morning. But here's the thing about tutoring. Because we are a local control state, Oregon has no statewide implementation of a strategy like that. There's the state can suggest, but nobody has said to all of these districts, this is what research tells us is the best thing. You need to spend some of your money that we are giving you on this to help the kids who are the furthest behind.
You mentioned funding. Not only is there the sort of the usual primarily property tax funded school money, but also a great deal of federal aid, right, from the pandemic, acknowledging and trying to sort of head off some of this learning loss, and that's intended to help pay for some of these more expensive interventions.
Well, yes. the bulk of most states districts actually get the bulk of their money from income tax funded state schools fund and state schools money, although there certainly are about 1/3 of a typical district's money might come from property taxes. But yes, you're talking about what we nerdy education types call ESSER dollars. And that is money that the federal government set aside specifically for academic and pandemic relief for schools. And Oregon got a total of about $1.7 billion of that. It's a lot of money, although it has to be distributed across nearly 200 school districts. So it gets spread a little bit thinner. Unfortunately, that money is use it or lose it. It expires next year. So districts have one more year with that cushion. A lot of districts have used it to pay for things like educational aides, paraeducators, but by and large, districts have been a little bit careful about using it to pay for staff, because what you don't want to do is spend a bunch of money on people and then after 3 years be like, sorry, your money's gone. We can no longer pay for you, right? So also, the federal government only requires a certain percentage of that money to be spent on academic recovery. It's less than you might think. We have, I've done some checking in with districts about how they've used that money, and it can really vary. Some places do spend it on tutoring or summer school. I know PPS put a lot of theirs into summer school, for example. And then there have been districts that have chosen to use that money for things like facilities and maintenance, which are, giant backlogged issues that really do need attention. And that maybe frees up money to be spent elsewhere, but that's not going to, a new turf field or a new roof is not going to help any kid that, is 4 grade levels behind.
You mentioned some of the disparities that these test scores reveal in Portland public schools. And can you talk a little more about the disparities that you have seen in Portland and elsewhere? And is there a risk of those getting worse in this sort of difficult time of trying to play catch up?
Yes. I was looking at the Woodburn School District today. I am always interested in Woodburn because it was really one of the first places in Oregon where it was a majority Latino in that school district. And I have always thought of it as kind of a harbinger for the rest of the state because Oregon is been slower to change than the rest of the country, but we're changing. We're changing quickly. Unfortunately, in Woodburn, last year, 10.5% of all kids there met proficiency standards in math, which is, as you heard me say, way below even the pretty dismal state level of 30%. This year, it slipped. It's 8.7%. So it is going to get worse. This is an emergency. And I feel like I've been shouting that from the rooftops all week. What is frustrating about trying to report on this is that you often have people saying to you, well, these are deep, intractable problems that take time to solve. So, for example, the governor, I asked specifically about kids who speak English as a second language today, and the governor's office said, well, the Oregon Department of Education has a new migrant education team, and we are working to develop a plan for multilingual and migrant education students. And that is terrific. I'm so happy to hear that there is focus on that population. And I don't love the we are working to develop a plan, because these kids are in school now. And it's not like we don't know what to do. We do. We know that kids can benefit from in-school tutoring. We know that kids can benefit from an extended school day. We know that kids can benefit from academically rigorous summer school. And yet the legislature chose to actually disinvest from summer school this year. So when you say to me, will it get worse? Boy, I hope not. I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't know that I felt the alarm that I thought I would. this week from education officials statewide.
There was a curious wrinkle in your story where you noted that so many high school students opted out of taking the test that the results aren't considered reliable. I think that's for 11th grade.
Correct. Yeah.
Why do students opt out? And what does that tell us?
Well, our state laws do make it possible for students to opt out of these tests. And certainly by the time kids get to 11th grade, that is considerably more common. State education officials highlighted participation rates this year, and they said they were glad to see those tick up, particularly in the elementary and on some level the middle school level, but acknowledge that there's still a lot of work to do in addressing 11th grade in particular participation rates. And it's a real bummer because it just means that we kind of lose that data point. If under 80% of kids take the test, it's just not as statistically significant, right? And we lose an important data point that can really help inform us about how those kids that are closest to graduation, closest to going to college, or closest to joining the workforce are prepared to do so.
You mentioned some numbers that are coming out soon that will give more look at students' progress. You also mentioned some of the schools that you're looking to see, what is behind the improvements that happened here. I guess as you have sort of absorbed and digested these latest test scores, what have you been thinking about in terms of, sort of where your reporting might go over the weeks and months to come as a result of what you're seeing now?
That is such a good question. What I would like more than anything is something that I'm not sure I'll be able to do. Because what I would really like is to get into, and when I say into, I mean into the classroom of the districts that are struggling the most. And in particular, close to home, I think a lot about the kids in East Multnomah County. There's a clutch of about 5 districts out there with, their scores vary, but consistently below what you see in Portland and on the west side suburbs, right? So I'd like to get in there. I'd like to see what's being done now to help those kids. And I'd like to understand more about other factors that are keeping those kids from being able to reach proficiency. Because schools can't solve every problem on their own, right? I mean, one of the things you'll often hear school officials say is, okay, well, we have to start with attendance because no kid's going to learn if they're not in school. So, and chronic absenteeism rates have gone, test scores may have fallen, but chronic absenteeism rates have skyrocketed since the pandemic. So, what are these districts doing to get kids there? What are they doing to keep them there? What are they doing to help address their social emotional needs? And please tell me how you're helping these kids catch up academically. And I don't know if I'll be able to get that story. I think it's really easy. If I call a district and I'm like, hey, you guys are a bright spot, they can't wait to get me on the phone. They can't wait to talk about it. It's a lot harder to call and say, your kids are struggling and I want to see what you're doing to make it better. But in a perfect world, that's what would happen.
Well, I hope we'll get to read those stories. I think it's important. And thank you, Julia, for taking the time to appear on Beat Check today.
Thank you so much for having me, Elliot. I'm so happy to do anything that I can to bring attention to this topic.
Well, we'll put links to Julia's coverage of these test scores in the show description. You can find all of her education coverage at OregonLive.com/education. And thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show, and tell a friend to help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and journalism like this is with a subscription to the Oregonian and OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.